Well, good morning. This is lecture on chapter 4 of the elbow, and this is in your positioning book, and this comes from the 9th edition. This first image we have is actually found on page 133, and it is figure 4.16, and this is an AP elbow. This is actually the distal humerus and the proximal radius and ulna that make up the elbow joint. Now, as far as the anatomy, this should be familiar to you all, but there's this little acronym here, the RCUT, and what that means is that the radius articulates with the capitulum and that the ulna articulates with the trochlea. And that's what actually forms that elbow joint, is the radial head articulating with the capitulum and the ulna articulating with the trochlea. You can see we have the medial and lateral epicondyle. That's an important landmark when we position, not only for the elbow, but when we talk about AP humerus, those become important. We have two little depressions on here. You have the coronoid fossa and the radial fossa. And then, like we said, we have the head of the radius. This is actually the radial tuberosity right here. This is the proximal radial ulnar joint in here. And then we have the trochlear sulcus, or the trochlear groove. And then this is actually a right elbow with the hand supinated, palm out, as if you were in anatomical position. And then the radius would be thumb side, and the ulna actually falls on the 5th digit side. If we look at the elbow in a lateral view, this also is on page 133. And again, this is the distal radius, proximal ulna, distal humerus, proximal ulna, and the radius. This is just looking at it from a side view. So you can see that we have the radial head right here. We have the the olecranon process right here, or the semilunar notch, trochlear notch right in here. And then you have the ridges of the capitulum and the trochlea on top of each other. Between those and this groove right here, this semilunar notch or trochlear notch, we're going to talk about the 3 concentric arcs that we need to look for to make sure that we have a perfectly lateral elbow. Okay, so again, anatomy is very important to what we do. These 3 concentric arcs that they talk about, basically you have the trochlear sulcus, which is 1, and 3 concentric arcs, meaning three circles or 3 arc shapes that you look for to make sure your elbow is lateral. You have the outer ridges of the capitulum and the trochlea on top of each other. And then we have the trochlear notch, or this depression right here, or the semilunar notch, as some refer to that. And then you can see radiographically how you can see these 3 concentric arcs right here, all in a row. You can see radial head right here. This faint area is the radial tuberosity. Got the proximal radial ulnar joint, and then the elbow itself. And then this is the olecranon process, and this is distal humerus. And they talk about the posterior depression on the distal humerus is the olecranon fossa, and the olecranon process of the ulna fits into that olecranon fossa when the arm is fully extended. And it says that soft tissue detail is depicted by specific fat pads that are located within the olecranon fossa, and it's important in trauma diagnosis of the elbow joint. And we'll look at those fat pads in just a minute. But on a lateral elbow especially, this is where the area right in here and right back here, we tend to look for fat pads, because a positive fat pad sign is indicative of trauma or injury. And typically there's a fracture when you see a positive fat pad sign. If we look at the AP elbow as far as anatomy, this is on page 134. And you can see with letter A here, this is the medial epicondyle, which tends to be more prominent than the lateral epicondyle. And the lateral epicondyle is right here. F is the lateral epicondyle. So not as prominent as this one. If you palpate the inside of your elbow, the side with your arm extended out, palm up, you can definitely feel the medial epicondyle much more so than the lateral epicondyle. And then letter B here, we have the trochlea. C, we have the coronoid tubercle. D is the radial head, right here, radial head. Radial neck would be right here, and radial tuberosity is right here. E, we have the capitulum. F, like it is the lateral epicondyle, not as prominent. And then H is the olecranon process that you can kind of see coming through, and that sits in the olecranon fossa. Now that is an AP elbow. How do we know? Because there is superimposition of the radial head, neck, and tuberosity over the ulna in the AP. And then if we look at the lateral, we can see starting with, we ended with H, letter I here is the trochlear sulcus. J is the trochlear notch, right in here, this second little line in the concentric arc. And then K is actually the double outer ridges of the capitulum, the trochlea. So when they talk about those three concentric arcs, that's what you're looking for: the trochlear sulcus, the trochlear notch, and the double outer ridges of the capitulum. Okay? And that is the lateral elbow. Again, when we look at fat pad signs, we're going to be looking in here, and we're going to be looking back here when we look for these fat pads. The elbow joint itself is a synovial joint, meaning that there's synovial fluid in there, and it is a diarthrital joint. And here you can see the proximal radial ulnar joint. That is a pivot type, meaning it allows us to pronate, supinate our hand. And the elbow joint is a ginglymus or a hinge type joint, meaning it can open and close like a door, allowing us that hinge-like motion. As far as the rotation that we have with the elbow, when we look at that, this is an AP right elbow. All right, and there's no rotation on this because the radius and the ulna are partially superimposed. That's how you know it's an AP. You can see the radial tuberosity, the neck radius, and the head are partially over the ulna. And then when we look at the elbow, this left elbow, now why they do right, left, right, I'm not sure, but this is definitely a right elbow. This is a left elbow. So the radius is lateral. So again, arm extended, palm up. And this has external rotation or lateral rotation. And when we do that lateral rotation or external rotation, you actually have the radial head, neck, and tuberosity become free of superimposition from the ulna. So this space right here that you see is indicative that this is an externally rotated elbow, a 45-degree external or a 45-degree lateral oblique. And then when we look at this one, this is actually a right elbow, and this is internal rotation or medial rotation. So a 45-degree medial or a 45-degree internally rotated elbow. And how we know that, you can see that now the radial head and neck is completely superimposed by the ulna, but we can actually see the coronoid process here. And it sticks out, and that's one of the things to know if you have an internal versus an external. On the external, the radial head, neck, and tuberosity are free of superimposition. And on the internal, the coronoid process is in profile. All right, those fat pads I was talking about, these are actually found on page 137. And we have the anterior fat pad, which is labeled by letter C. We have the posterior fat pad, which would be back here. And we have the supinator fat stripe, which is up here by letter E. Okay, and typically on a lateral elbow, this is where you would see a positive fat pad sign. Now you can see in this, there is a broken olecranon process on here. You see the fracture lines right there. Okay, and you can actually, according to the book, you can see a positive anterior and posterior fat pad. In the supinator stripe, but I'll be honest, I don't, it's very hard to see these. You can kind of see right up in here where that dark area is, and then this dark area here. Now, that probably is blood in the tissue, but a lot of times when you see a positive fat pad sign, that's what it looks like, an area of increased density or decreased brightness, a little bit darker in there. And a lot of times when you see a positive fat pad sign, which is very hard, I do not see them on this, but if we saw a positive fat pad sign, it's usually indicative of injury, meaning this should produce a fat pad sign just because of the olecranon process being broken like that, but it could be with the labeling that we're not really seeing that very well. You can kind of see here with the capitulum and the trochlea, see how they're not perfectly superimposed, so you're not getting those three concentric arcs like we should, not to mention you're not going to get that third arc where the trochlear notch or semilunar notch is because the olecranon process is actually broke. So you've got half of the notch here and then the other half is over here because of this fracture. Okay, so a positive fat pad sign is indicative of injury or fracture. Now we will get into the positioning of the elbow. And for the elbow, there are actually 4 positions that are considered routine for the elbow. We have an AP, a 45-degree internal or medial oblique, meaning that the arm is rotating towards midline or towards the body. We have a 45-degree external or lateral oblique, which is meaning that the arm, the extended arm, is rotating away from the body. And we have a lateral. Now, the ERIC, basically when I was saying to you that the radial head, neck, and tuberosity were free of superimposition, that just means that on the external, the radial head, neck, and tuberosity are free of superimposition. And on the internal, that's where we demonstrate the coronoid process in profile. The technique for all of these images is 70 kVp at 2 mass. Now, ideally when your patient comes in, they would be able to fully extend their elbow. But if there's an elbow injury, sometimes that is not possible. Okay, but in theory, we would like a fully extended AP elbow. How do we know it's fully extended and completely AP? The epicondyles that are on the humerus, the medial and lateral epicondyle, should be parallel to the IR. So you have to palpate that area and make sure that they are parallel to the IR, that there's no rotation in the elbow joint itself. And the central on this is not difficult. It is actually mid-elbow. Now, if the patient can't fully extend their arm, then you have to do 2 AP views in a partially flexed position. When they can't extend the elbow, you have to do one with the humerus parallel to the IR, and then a second one with the forearm parallel to the IR. Okay, so if they can't straighten it, whatever the injury is, you end up having to do 2 of the APs, one with the forearm parallel, one with the humerus parallel. And this is actually something they love to ask on job interviews. They want to see if you can critically think, and a lot of times they'll say to you, Let's say you have a patient come in with an elbow injury and they cannot extend the elbow completely. What would you do? And they're looking for you to say, well, I would take 2 APs, one with the humerus parallel, one with the forearm parallel, and I would evaluate those and then go from there. That's typically what they're looking for. And then with both, the central ray is perpendicular, again, to mid-elbow. So that's considered trauma. If the patient is unable to fully extend the elbow, that is what we would need to do. Now, on the AP, to compare them, this is an AP with the arm fully extended. Okay, so arm straight out, injury, but not that they can't straighten their arm out. And again, remember we said that the radial head, neck, and tuberosity superimposed by the ulna. That's how we know it's an AP. And then we look at the lateral and medial epicondyle, and we want to make sure those are parallel to the IR. These two are the views when the patient could not straighten their arm. So this one was done with the humerus parallel to the IR, central ray mid-elbow. This one was done with the forearm parallel to the IR, central ray again mid-elbow. Okay, so when the patient cannot fully extend, this is what they would look like. You can see there's a little bit, looks a little bit elongated on the humerus when that's parallel, and this radius and ulna look a little bit elongated when the forearm is parallel. So once you do the AP, then we go on to our obliques, and we do 2 obliques, both at 45 degrees. We do a 45-degree lateral or a 45 external oblique, meaning she is rolling away from midline. Her arm is rolling backwards, so she's externally rotating it. And on that one, this is the one, the external, will place the radial head, neck, and tuberosity free of superimposition. This one, typically with the arm extended, if you simply supinate the hand or turn your hand palm down, that will typically put your elbow into a perfect 45-degree medial oblique or internal oblique. And this is the one that allows us to visualize the coronoid process in profile. Okay, so 45-degree medial oblique, we simply pronate the hand. And on the 45-degree lateral or external oblique, you're literally having to roll the patient backwards. Sometimes they have to actually lean their back backwards because you can't usually just turn your arm. You can't extend it that far. Sometimes if you lean their shoulders back, that actually helps. Now, what would the images look like? First, we'll look at the external rotation. So this is the one where they lean back and you kind of roll their arm out. So on this 45-degree lateral or external oblique, again, the radial head, neck, and tuberosity are free of superimposition, and the lateral epicondyle and the capitulum are in profile. Okay, so this is a right arm fully extended, patient rolling backwards or rolling away from midline to make the radial head, neck, and tuberosity free of superimposition. And then on the internal or the medial oblique, this is where the hand is simply pronated. This one will actually throw the coronoid process into profile right here. You can see the olecranon process back here, radial head is right here, and neck. That's completely superimposed, but this coronoid process of the ulna sticks right out, and that's what we're looking for on the 45-degree medial or internal oblique. Then we move on to the lateral elbow, and with the lateral elbow, the elbow must be flexed to 90 degrees. Okay, we flex the elbow 90 degrees, and the humerus and the forearm are parallel to the IR. So you want to make sure you have a really good 90-degree angle between the forearm and the humerus. Okay. One thing, and the central ray is still mid-elbow. And the technique for all of these was 70 kVp at 2 mass. Now let me go back for one thing that I wanted to tell you that I'm not really sure I did. If we go back, all of these positions, the patient has to have not only their arm extended, but for all of these, they have to have the shoulder, the elbow, and the wrist all in the same plane, which means the patient has to either slouch in the chair or you need to raise the table up so that the wrist, the elbow, and the shoulder are all in the same plane. Okay, so either of two ways you can do that. You can either raise the table so it brings the arm up equal with the shoulder, or you could have a patient slouch down in the chair, like slide their rear end forward so that they slouch down. All right, and the central ray on all of these is mid elbow joint, and the technique is 70 kVp at 2 mass. Again, for the medial and lateral oblique, or the 45 internal and 45 external, notice her shoulder, her elbow, and her wrist are all in the same plane. That's very important for all of these images. So whether she's slouched down in the chair or they raise the table up, either way is acceptable as long as everything is in the same plane. All right, and then same thing for the lateral when we do the lateral. So patient slouch down, elbow is at a 90-degree angle, the humerus is at a 90-degree angle to the forearm, they're still slouched, central ray is still mid-elbow, and they tell you on the lateral, the mid-elbow is approximately 1.5 inches medial olecranon process. So what they're saying is if you palpate the olecranon process, you come 1.5 inches medial or towards the middle of the elbow. So from the olecranon process, you're coming in to the center. Okay, marker placement. Let's go back and look and see where they have the marker for the AP, because it should be lateral to the part, which it is. So this is a right marker, and it is lateral because the thumb side would be lateral, or the radius. And notice the marker placement now. Up until this point, everything has hung fingers up. Now, this is actually hanging humerus up. Okay, so the next few things that we look at this week, we are going to be hanging humerus up. So forearm hung fingers up, and that was the last thing we talked about. Now we're in elbow. Fingers would be down here, shoulder up here. So it hangs humerus up. So this marker placement is correct on the AP. When we look at the obliques, there was no real marker in the images, but you can see on this medial oblique, this is a right arm, and they have the right marker medial to the part. So ideally the marker would be on this side, and it is placed correctly. You can see that when this hangs, it would read properly with the humerus up, so that is correct, but it should be on the other side. Same with this one. This marker should be on the other side. Let's see if it's in the images. Yes, it is in the image here, but ideally that marker would be up here, or at least on this side, the lateral aspect of the elbow. Okay, so marker placement on that one is correct, because this is the internal rotation that demonstrates the coronoid process in profile, and the right is on the lateral aspect, and it's humerus up, so that one is correct. And then when we look at the lateral, it does hang humerus up. So in this previous picture, the way they have the marker is not correct, because if you hang that humerus up, that right is going to be laying down, correct? Like if you imagine that film hanging this way, where the top is here and the bottom's here, then that marker is actually sideways. So that marker should just be moved. Let me try and draw it for you. That marker should be moved on this side, and it should be so that the right would hang that way. Okay, so marker should be on that side. And then when we look at the image, it's not bad, at least it's reading correctly, but it still would be better over here. That would be better marker placement to place it. It's hard to draw. Better marker placement would be where it was and then reading like that. Okay. All right. So again, on this particular image, let me go back to the pointer. You're looking for the 3 concentric arcs, the capitulum and the trochlea, the trochlear sulcus, right in here. Excuse me. You're looking for those 3 concentric arcs of the elbow. Notice that the humerus, it is at a 90-degree angle to the radius and the ulna. So that actually is a really good lateral elbow. Now you can see they just barely got the soft tissue on there. You can see soft tissue here where the elbow crease is. And if we look back at the image prior, we see definitely that they've got all of the soft tissue. It just looks like on this particular image, they came awfully close. You don't ever want to not include the soft tissue on an elbow because sometimes you'll see bleeding into the tissue, which is pretty much indicative that something is going on in there. So you want to make sure if the radiologist sees blood in the soft tissue that he's looking a little bit harder, a little bit deeper at any issues that might be in there. Alrighty, and that takes us to the end of elbow. If you look in your book, actually on page, starting on page 173 and 174, there are some additional views that they show you if there is trauma for the elbow. When they're looking for the coil method, a lot of times these are done for pathologies. In the area of the radial head or the coronoid process. And it's also, the coil method also works really well if the patient can't extend their elbow fully for the obliques. And then on 174, when there are radial head or radial neck fractures, there are some different views that they show you of positioning the hand, whether the hand is supinated, lateral, pronated, or internally rotated. It can demonstrate some radial head fractures, and radial head fractures on a patient are horrible. They're not able to, typically they're not able to pronate and supinate their hand because that's that proximal radial ulnar joint that allows for that. And when there's a radial head fracture, they're limited in that movement, and usually they're in a lot of agony when the patient is suffering from that. So make sure you look at those additional views there, and we will meet up in the live and discuss. Have a good day.